Hi everyone, happy Monday and welcome to week 2 of our course. I'm excited to see you all. I hope that some of you actually watched this video. Anyway, I wanted to talk about a few things that came up in last week's discussion board and then give you some tips for this week, and remember that, and to remind you that you have your first exam due this week as well. So the discussion board posts were really good this week, and I think if you read through them all, it'll really help you understand both the D'Amelio and Rupp's readings a little bit better. A couple things I wanted to highlight. First, D'Amelio and Rupp both come from the social constructionist school of thought around the history of sexuality. So both of them are interested in understanding how historical geographical contexts shape this thing called sexuality. So that means that neither of them buy into, say, the myth of the eternal homosexual, the idea that there have always been gay people. Instead, they're interested in, well, what allows a gay identity to emerge? Why does it emerge historically in industrial capitalism in the West? What are the relations that happen there, right? And so just to remind you from D'Amelio, the first thing that happens is that switch from the nuclear family in agriculture to the city and the ability to be single, right? So that shift means that you can economically survive on your own, which means you don't have to be tied to a reproductive unit. So that combined with the fact that people are now working in factories and in cities and living near each other means that people have both the situational possibility for same-sex desire to form, but that they also have the economic ability to follow through with that. So some of you in your discussion board posts emphasize that there's been same-sex sexual activity going back through history in all places. One of you pointed out, for example, how the Spartans had very close male friendships, and this looks very much like contemporary gay life. Both Rupp and D'Amelio would say that's part of our presentism, right? Taking our contemporary glasses and using them to see practices from the past. And they both caution us against doing that, partly because it keeps us from understanding the depth and complexity of how other cultures organize sexuality, but then it also keeps us from understanding our present as something that is socially made and could be made differently. And as we move through the course, we'll learn a lot about some of the inequalities and oppressions that follow people who engage in certain kinds of sexual activities or have certain sexual identities. And if we don't understand that sexuality to be constructed, then it's hard to understand how we'd ever change it, right? So it has as much of a political push as the essentialist construction of sexuality, which would argue that, hey, there have always been gay people. We've always been here. We were born that way. So obviously you can't kill us, right? It's sort of the political upshot of that. So one thing that is really different about contemporary organizations of sexuality that I wanted to highlight today is the difference between sexual acts and sexual identities. So sexual acts, right? A penis and a vagina, right? That's been happening since penises and vaginas existed, right? But what that means and whether or not that means that you are defined by that being the kind of sex you want to have, that's what's contemporary, right? So the idea that those acts form an identity, that's what's really new. So John D'Amelio is not arguing that men didn't have sex with men until industrial capitalism, but what he is arguing is that the idea that a man having sex with a man means something specific about himself, that he's a different kind of species of human called gay, that's what's new, right? And that's a really, really big difference. So that shift from sexual acts to sexual identities is a really important thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about the history of sexuality. A couple things about your readings for this week. One is a historical approach to understanding where heterosexuals come from. One of the issues in sexuality studies, I think, is that people think they're going to learn about gay people, but straight people have just as much of a history of sexuality as anybody else, right? It's often unmarked and it's seen as natural, but it's not. And so you're reading from Hannah Blank will show how this idea that having sex with someone who is the opposite sex or gender, that becomes who you are as a person, that is also historically specific. The second reading for this week is about it's about how mass media helped sort of define and spread ideas of transgender identity. And she's going to talk specifically, Joan Meyerowitz is going to talk specifically about the origins of transsexuality, and you're going to learn about Christine Jorgensen and the way that her sort of famous case moved through media and helped people see themselves and define themselves in relation to her experience. And that sort of mass movement through mass media really empowered a lot of people to make demands on their doctors and really change how gender non-normativity is thought about and lived. So, and I think when you're reading that, keep in mind if you're somebody who's on social media a lot, or you're a Tumblr or whatever, you've likely seen an explosion of identity categories and how those identity categories circulate and offer new possibilities for ways to imagine who you can be, right, in terms of gender and sexuality. So while this is an article about a historical incident, I think that if you think about your present day and the circulation of narratives around gender and sexuality, I think you'll see some commonalities. And then finally, I've asked you to watch a film this week. It's called Screaming Queens, and it's by Susan Stryker, is the maker of the movie. And it's a really important film, first for understanding why history is important. Stryker articulates really well why doing historical work matters in terms of gender and sexuality. But then secondly, you'll learn a lot about the sort of emergence of trans identity and how that's related to things like police violence, economics, urban revitalization, employment, all kinds of things. So I think that it's a really important and interesting film, and it's by and Susan Stryker is our leading historian about transgender identity. So I'm grateful for this film. So I hope that you enjoy the work for this week. You don't have a discussion board based on that, but you do have your first exam due at the end of the week. So a couple of tips on that. First, the difference between an A paper and a C paper is how you use evidence. I want to see you really grapple with the readings and the films if you decide to use film text. And I want you to use direct evidence, quotations from the text in support of your points. This isn't just to prove that you did the reading. The reason I ask you to do this is because it's part of how you make a strong argument, is by having evidence. Also, we're all scholars, and part of being a scholar is putting ourselves in conversation with other scholars. And when you use quotations and really grapple with the text at that level, that's when you're having that conversation. So that's my tip, is to really build your answers around the evidence. And that just means quotations. I'm going to post on Blackboard something I call the 4I system, and it's a way of integrating quotations in your text. If you feel confident in your ability to do that, then you don't need to read over that. But if you want a little refresher, I think it's a good system. It's just about how you integrate quotations and making sure that you interpret those quotations and explain to your reader how the evidence helps support your point. And on that note, I also want to point out that Special Sessions does have, the Writing Center is still open during the summer, and tutoring is open during the summer. So if either of those resources would be helpful to you, please avail yourselves of them. All right, that's all for right now, but I will pop in later this week and see how everything's going. Feel free to email if you have any questions or you want me to look over a first answer for your exam, anything like that. I'm here, so happy reading and viewing, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.